Lots of people talk about what do organizations need to do, what do leaders need to do differently to prevent burnout, and there's lots of good research there. Of course, sometimes it comes across like a guilt trip or an extra burden, but one of the pieces that doesn't get talked about nearly as much, especially professionally, is how do you recover? If you are burned out, how do you recover? Because not everybody can just quit their job and go on a big frolicking vacation to try to recover from their burnout. Most of us have to at least perform some of that recovery while we're still on the job. So how do you recover, whether you're still working the same job or things have changed for you? How do you walk a path that's going to help you to recover? Well, I'm talking to you, as you know now, as a burnout survivor, and a little bit separated from that time of burnout in a very different place now. And I can tell you that there's been things that have helped me to recover from that. So what I'm going to present to you now is going to be a number of options that you might want to try. And then there's activities that kind of go along with these too. So it's not just me telling you, it would be something you need to spend some time on, but some options that you can take to recover. I'm purposeful about using the word options because whereas an organization has steps I think they must take, for individuals, I think we have to choose what's going to work well for us. So I'm going to present these as options. Some were direly important for me. Others were not as important, but I think are really important for other people. And then, of course, there's some things that I did that I haven't included on the list here as far as personal recovery. So I'm going to give you 7 options and talk about why we're going through those 7 options. Before we get on that path of talking about those 7 options, the prerequisite is recognizing, identifying the moral distress that you've been experiencing and your own burnout. So going back to the characteristics of burnout and doing a little bit of self-introspection and saying, am I emotionally exhausted? Am I always worn out with this job, even after time off, even after a weekend where I didn't get called, that sort of thing? Do I feel like I'm cynical all the time? Do I feel like I've lost my ability to make a difference when I come to work? Like I'm not finding as much meaning in my work anymore. And we have to get honest. It is shocking how difficult it is for us to acknowledge that we're burned out. And we may even throw the word around, but then when somebody pins us down, we're like, you think you're really burned out? We're like, no, I don't think that. Most of the clients that I've coached and coworkers that I've talked with about their burnout can only identify it in retrospect. It's really hard to identify in the moment, but to recover from burnout, we have to, of course, say, yes, I am experiencing burnout. So the first option that I want to present to you is to really look over the expectations you have of yourself, because we can escape the expectations of an organization or a coworker or a boss, but we can't escape the expectations we have of ourselves. So ask yourself, what sort of expectations do I have, and are those reasonable? So imagine yourself talking with a friend, a colleague, someone that you respect, that you care about, and they're telling you about the stress that they're under at work, and they're saying, but these are the things, I have to keep doing this, I have to keep doing this, I have to keep doing this, it's so important, and they're putting pressure on themselves. Imagine having that conversation with a friend and how you would respond. And so now, putting that foot on the other, or that shoe on the other foot, imagine for yourself talking with someone who cares deeply about you, and you're expressing the expectations that you've laid on yourself. Are they reasonable? If they are, great. I'm not trying to convince you that your expectations of yourself are unreasonable, but if your expectations are at a level 10 and your energy and capacity is at a level 4, that's not reasonable. If your energy and capacity right now is a level 4 and you perform to a level 4, it means you're doing 100% of what you can do. But if you're trying to do beyond 100%, that's when the cycle will continue and recovery will remain elusive. Second of all, and this is similar to addressing the expectations, but I want you to think about your focus and your level of intensity. So one of the things I've found with my coaching clients is that they think about work when they're not at work a lot. And I will admit fully that was so guilty of having lots of thoughts about work when I wasn't at work. So that level of focus where you're waking up in the morning thinking about work, you're going to bed at night thinking about work, you're thinking about work when you're doing things that are supposed to be fun or with a friend or with a family member. That level of focus is driving your burnout. It just is. And then thinking about intensity. So my counselor wisely told me in the middle of my burnout, if you just quit this job, because of course when we're burned out, we want to quit the job, right? That's one of the things that comes to our mind. She said you could quit this job, but if you take another job and that job matches the level of intensity of what you're doing right now, you will not recover from your burnout. And that was true. That was good advice. The caveat to that is we can manufacture intensity, can't we? So you may work a job in a nursing home and a healthcare system that's very intense, and you might say the reason that this feels so intense is because it is. The actual things that are happening is life or death, or people are upset, or I've got too much work to do, and so it's intense. However, we can loop on that intensity in our brains and sort of rev up even more intensity. In fact, it's possible that you could switch jobs, that job not be as intense in the actuality of the tasks that you have to do, and yet your brain might continue to make it very intense, and you might have the poor outcomes mental health wise, thought life, etc., because you're making that so intense. So this is a challenge. This is such a challenge. If you've been real intense about work, uber focused about it, maybe hyper responsible, like we talked about with the nurse manager's experience sometimes, and all of us experience at times, trying to say, I'm going to care just a little bit less this year about my job, or I'm going to focus a little bit less, or I'm just not going to be as intense about things, can be a real challenge, but it's a helpful framework to consider as you try to recover from your burnout. So option number 3, this was one that was totally new to me in my recovery, and that is to give attention to your nervous system. Um, so when we're in fight or flight all the time, and our nervous system is constantly in that hyper vigilant state, it's very hard to recover. It's very hard to be healthy mentally and emotionally. Of course, that fight or flight response is ingrained in our nervous system, so that if there's a bear in the woods or a lion in the jungle, that we know to stay away from it and to run away from it. The problem is that sometimes the call light feels like the lion in the jungle, or the email or the meeting feels like the bear in the woods, and it sets our fight or flight response on high alert. When that's happening repetitively all the time, our nervous system can become so overloaded. And so, what I learned, you've heard my story about cardioversion and my heart being out of rhythm. What I learned, but not until 6 months later, was that I was actually diagnosed with vaguely mediated AFib. And so my electrophysiologist, my cardiologist, looked at me and said, the reason your heart went out of rhythm, and he said, well, I don't usually diagnose. I don't usually say why a person is experiencing AFib, but in your situation, with all the information that you've given me, I can tell that your heart went out of rhythm because your nervous system was overloaded. It's very interesting that I've had many people since I've started to share that story publicly and with coaching clients, public speaking engagements online. It's been very surprising and sad to me how many people have come to find me afterwards and say, I think that I experienced the same thing. My heart went out of rhythm, or they had some sort of breakdown or whatever, and it was tied to what was happening inside of their nervous system. So in the fall of 2022, shortly after that experience I had on my 44th birthday with my heart going out of rhythm, During the season when I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety, and I knew something had to change with work, I discovered some of these exercises to give focus and attention to our nervous system. My wife introduced me to these, and I started to practice these. And I knew from the very beginning this was something that was a big deal for me, and was confirmed, of course, then by my doctor later. So I want to have you practice one of these with me right now. And so if you're in a place where you can do this, I'd like to invite you, if you're wearing glasses, take those glasses off. We're going to do a little exercise to give attention to our nervous system. To start, I'd like you to take the middle finger on each of your hands, put it below your eyes, where that thin place is, where you can feel the eye socket, and just make very gentle, but just a little bit of pressure. Make about 8 circles there. Once you've done that, I'm going to ask you to slide those same fingers around to the side of your temple, very similarly, with some light pressure, 8 circles there. And once you've done that, you're going to slide them above your eyebrows and then down to this thin place above the top of the bridge of your nose. And you're going to give 8 pressures there. And then you're going to slide back to your temples, 8 circles. I hope some of you are doing this with me and following along. And then you're sliding back down below your eyes and doing 8 circles there. Let's continue to do that. It's a pretty simple exercise. And while you're doing that, add to the exercise mindfulness that you have a vagus nerve that runs through your whole body that is reactive and responsive to the things that you experience on a daily basis at work, at home, in whatever environment that you're in. And that sometimes that vagus nerve gets overstimulated, and sometimes it stays that way for a long time. But there are things you can do through mindfulness, through physical exercises like what we're doing now, that give some attention to that nervous system to help it to calm down just a little bit, to say you don't have to be in fight or flight. There's not actually a bear in the woods. You're not actually in trouble. You're not actually in danger. And to begin that recovery process. So there's lots of creators, lots of contributors to this field. I'll include one here below. I don't necessarily recommend anyone more than another because I'm not an expert on this topic, but as a practitioner and somebody who's experienced the benefit of it, I want you to be aware of the possibility there too. Now, hopefully you didn't put yourself to sleep with that exercise and you're able to continue down our options for personal recovery from burnout, because the next one is one that I'm excited to talk with you about. The fourth option for recovery from your own personal burnout is to make a bucket list. And some of you are rolling your eyes. I know bucket lists on social media and watching people who are always, they're always going to the fancy beach and resort and doing skydiving and all that sort of thing. But stick with me for just a second, because where I really got caught on to the idea of a bucket list was even before the pandemic and before my own burnout. There's a speaker by the name of Ben Nemtin who came to an event for us, a leadership event, and he talked about the value of making a bucket list. And he talked about it from the perspective of his own experience when he was in such a depressed state that he could not leave his house as a young person for months on end. And without going through his whole story, which is a fascinating story, what got him out of that place was some friends coming to him and saying, let's do this big idea that they had of doing a bucket list journey together. And that sort of sparked a mental health recovery for him. And then in the, I think, 15 or 20 years since then, it has continued to be something that has moderated his depression and his mental health. So it's from that perspective that I want to encourage you to consider a bucket list. What a bucket list does for us is it reminds us that we matter even when we're not producing at work. That even if things aren't going well at work, or if things are going great at work, there's still something about us that has desires personally, things we want to do. It takes our mind away. Sometimes we can fixate or obsess or be overwhelmed by the stress that's happening when we're burned out. And a bucket list can fuel that inner sense of who I am, who I want to be, what I want to do, in the world. And so Ben actually has a bucket list journal. In fact, I have mine nearby. So unplanned introduction of my bucket list journal. This is my version, and this is actually from Ben, and he walks you through different categories and ways to think about things you might want to put on your bucket list. And so he encourages us to make a bucket list that has 100 items. That probably sounds like a lot to you. Every time I say that to a client or to an audience, their eyes kind of go wide, like 100 items on a bucket list. Now, they don't all have to be, take a trip to Italy. Some things are small. In fact, I want to share a very small one that I had on my list. Maybe a couple of them. One was that I wanted to boil a teapot until it whistled. I had never done that. It seemed like it would be fun. It would be satisfying. I'm not a tea drinker. I've usually got my cup of coffee with me. Coffee doesn't whistle. It's not supposed to anyway. But I put that on my bucket list as a very small thing. And very quickly after that, Chris and I had gone away. My wife and I had gone away for a while, and we were at an Airbnb, and that Airbnb had a rack of tea bags, had a tea kettle, and boy, I filled that thing up, boiled it, and it whistled, and it was indeed satisfying. It was satisfying because it's just cool that they whistle at the end, right? Like, that's just a neat thing. But it was also very gratifying to me because I said in my head and actually put on my bucket list that it was something I wanted to do, and then I did it. Can you see where this energy is the opposite of what we experience with burnout when we start to feel like we don't matter anymore, we can't make a difference, we're emotionally exhausted? The energy that a bucket list provides, even when we're really worn out, is the opposite energy that we experience in burnout. One of my others was to visit the Boy Scout camp that I had gone to when I was a kid and growing up. It's only like 20 minutes away from our house. I'd just never been back as an adult. Wanted my kids to see it. We went there. The staff there was not ready for visitors. They were in the middle of a camp. They really didn't want to entertain us as visitors. But when I said, this is on my bucket list, there was a very kind woman who walked us around the camp and let us see that whole camp. That was a great day. It was a great day because it was something I wanted to do. I was able to have my family with me, relive some childhood memories. Actually saw some people I knew, which I wasn't expecting. But you can see how the energy of the bucket list is quite the opposite of the energy of burnout. So if you haven't started that bucket list yet, use the journal, use a note on your phone, use your own journal where you write things down. Piece of paper, write those things down, take a little step in that direction, talk with your friends and family about the fact that you want to do these things. Sometimes other people can make things happen for you. If you just tell them, this is something I want to do and it's on my bucket list, you'll be surprised that if they have that in their capacity, they may do that for you. We've had that experience ourselves. All right, option 5. I could talk about bucket lists all day, but we're going to go on to option 5. And this one is so important. Option 5 for your personal burnout recovery is to draw boundaries. Depending on your profession, depending on your role within healthcare, this can be extremely difficult to draw those boundaries. But the practice I want you to do, the exercise I want you to take, is to identify things that are really draining your energy. What's that meeting, that task, that scope of responsibility, that person that really just drains you, and you dread having to do it, you dread having to see that person, you dread having to go to that meeting. Afterwards, you feel even more deflated than you normally do. To identify those things and then say, is there any way that I can dial this down? Is it appropriate for me to hand that meeting off to someone else? If it's not, do I have to go to it every time it meets? Is it a weekly meeting? Is it a bi-weekly meeting? Is it a monthly meeting? Can I occasionally just get the notes from it afterwards so it's not draining my energy like that? In extreme cases, of course, a leave of absence is something to consider. Most places, they're not they're not going to be excited about having you gone for a while, but they'd rather have you gone for a while and then come back and keep working there than to lose you altogether. So considering whether that's a medical leave or some sort of way that you step aside for a while, drawing boundaries on a daily basis, and trying to stick with just doing what's yours to do most of the time, identifying those things or people or events or meetings, tasks that draw your energy and deflate you the most, and saying, is there a way I can dial these down a little bit? You won't be able to turn all of them all the way off, but can I dial those down a little bit so they don't have quite as much of an impact on me? Or do I really need some time away from this? Number 6 is to develop some personal mantras, some reminders, because when we're burned out, it can feel as though when we're cynical, that means we're thinking things can never change. But developing some mantras can remind us of truth that might go beyond those cynical moments. So the number one mantra that was meaningful to me during my darkest time, when I was at my lowest, my most depressed, my most burned out, was simply the sentence, "Things can change at any time." Maybe that would be helpful for you to adopt. Maybe it'd be helpful for you to say with me right now, "Things can change at any time." Because when we're cynical, we don't really think things are going to change. We think this is how it's always going to be. It's always going to be horrible. Things are just going to get worse and worse and worse. But that's not necessarily true. Things do change. Now, they don't always change the way we wish that they would change, but things certainly do always change. So repeating to yourself, things can change at any time. And you know what? For me, things did change. There were some significant changes that came about, and it had this interesting impact when some of those things did change. And then I felt very affirmed about that mantra to have said to myself, things can change at any time. When things did change, it felt as though, yeah, here we are, and these things are changing. Another idea is, this too shall pass. One that Kristen loves is, I've survived 100% of my worst days. So I may be facing an awful day today. I'm reminding myself I have survived all of these awful days up to this point, and I can survive that again. A more recent mantra for me as I wrapped up my time in healthcare was, it's not my job to save the world. It's not my job to save the world. Sometimes those expectations that we put on ourselves, the responsibility that we put on ourselves, and just to remind ourselves that we're not superheroes. We're not God. We don't have the ability to change everything. We can't save the world. And in fact, it's not our job to save the world. So find a mantra. Of course, there's a million of them online. If these 4 don't really resonate, things can change at any time. This too shall pass. I've survived 100% of my worst days. Or it's not my job to save the world. If none of those really resonate, there's a million more online. Find some that help you in the middle of your burnout, and remind yourself of those regularly. And last but not least, and there's lots of other options for personal recovery, but these are the 7 I wanted to mention. So number 7 is just to confide in 1 or 2 trusted people. So we tend to do either one extreme or the other. Either we keep it all bottled up, we don't tell anybody how emotionally exhausted we are, how cynical we're feeling, etc., or we complain about it to everybody. We sprinkle those complaints about how burned out, how upset we are, how fried we are, etc. We sprinkle that around to everyone. I would suggest that finding that middle ground of finding 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4 at most, people that you can really open up to, whether that's a counselor, a friend, a peer, a family member that you can just really open up to and say, this is how this is impacting me. Not just the throwaway comment of like, oh, I'm so burned out. Oh, work's so stressful. I'm so busy. But to say, I think this is what's happening to me. This is how I feel about these things. Just the act, I found with my coaching clients, I think I give them great advice when I'm coaching them. Surely I give them great advice when I'm coaching them. But I think that a lot of why coaching helps for people who are dealing with work stress and potential burnout, why it helps is because they're just able to say these things out loud. To say, there's this person at work who is driving me crazy, not just because they're irritating, but because of something more profound. or to say, this happened and I feel so badly about it, or to say, no matter what I do, I can't stop thinking about work, or to say, I checked email at a time I shouldn't have checked email, and it set me spinning on a mental hamster wheel for a long time about things with work. Just being able to say those things out loud and to have someone reflect those back to you can be really helpful in your recovery process. So that's the last option I want to mention for now, is confide in one or two trusted people. So I've mentioned the coaching that I do several times. I'd be happy to talk with you about coaching and what that looks like if you're in that place of burnout, trying to figure out one of two things: a survival plan. How do I make sure I'm okay while I'm going through this burnout? How can I rejuvenate my own health? Or an escape plan, so a survival plan or an escape plan.